It was a sight that didn't fit in any story they'd been told. Rows upon rows of gleaming cars, new, unused, stretching as far as the horizon. The thrum of machinery echoed across the open air, a pulsing heart that drove men and steel in perfect harmony. For the young German prisoner standing on the platform, it was as if he had landed on a different planet. He clutched the rough wood of the train car, his eyes tracing the lines of assembly plants and smokestacks, unable to find the end. Everywhere he looked, there were workers, men and women, some laughing, some singing, all moving with a purpose that stunned him. No one seemed tired. No one looked afraid. In that moment, the world he thought he understood unraveled at the seams. Back home, the stories had been so different. In Hitler's Germany, the propaganda was relentless. America was weak, decadent, fractured by greed and laziness. He remembered the newsreels, grotesque cartoons of slouching, overweight Americans, factories in ruin, cities choking on their own failure. The Führer himself had mocked the United States, a nation, he said, that could never muster the resolve or unity to challenge the Reich. Even as the bombs fell over Berlin, even as the Eastern Front turned to mud and horror, the story never changed. The American machine was a paper tiger. But here, at the edge of this roaring sea of progress, all those words melted away. The prisoner glanced at the men beside him, some barely out of boyhood, others weathered by years at the front. Their faces told the same story: shock, disbelief, a creeping sense of awe that none dared voice aloud. They watched as freight trains clattered past, loaded with food, steel, mountains of supplies. American guards, young, confident, almost casual in their authority, kept a loose watch, more interested in a baseball game on the far field than the soldiers in their care. Everything was plentiful. Everything was in motion. There was no trace of the weakness they'd been promised. The scale of it all was incomprehensible. In Germany, scarcity had become a way of life. Ration cards, hunger, blackout curtains, the constant threat of air raids. Factories were bombed out shells, trains limped along shattered tracks, and the cities were haunted by the ghosts of a lost generation. Yet here, the trains ran on time and then some, unloading fresh fruits, new uniforms, endless fuel. Overhead, the sky was crisscrossed by the silver flashes of bombers returning from missions, machines so abundant that, in Germany, the rumor was Americans built airplanes faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. He turned to a fellow prisoner, an older NCO whose cynicism had always been unshakable. Even he was silent, lips parted, eyes darting over the horizon as if searching for a trick. But there was no trick, just reality, as blunt and undeniable as the clang of metal on metal. Some tried to rationalize it. Maybe this was a show, a carefully constructed illusion meant to demoralize and confuse. Yet, day after day, as the trains moved deeper into the heartland, the spectacle only grew. Each new camp brought new astonishments. Rows of barracks built in days, warehouses overflowing with tools, fields of wheat rising taller than a man. American farmers seemed to conjure food from the soil itself. American engineers built bridges and roads faster than the Reich could rebuild its ruins. There was music on the radio, laughter in the mess halls. The prisoners felt the uncomfortable sensation of envy. What did this mean for the war? For everything they'd been told to believe? In the quiet moments, the questions gnawed at them. How could a nation so rich, so organized, so unafraid, ever have been vulnerable? How could they themselves have been so utterly wrong? But just months earlier, these men had been convinced America was on its knees, a crumbling colossus, soon to fall under the weight of its own contradictions. Now, stripped of weapons and illusions, they stood before the reality that would shatter their certainties and haunt their memories for the rest of their lives. There is a moment in every life when the world cracks open, and truth pours in, unwelcome, unstoppable. It is a feeling as old as history itself. To be confronted by realities so vast and undeniable that the stories we once held dear begin to crumble. This, too, is the gift and the pain of seeing the world with new eyes. Myths have power, yes, but so does the courage to look beyond them, to witness with our own senses, to allow astonishment its proper place. It is easy to cling to old beliefs, to seek comfort in certainty, to hold the line even when the tide is turning. But the world belongs to those willing to question, to face the unknown not as an enemy, but as a teacher. In the end, what we see, truly see, has the power to transform us, if we let it. What did the Nazis tell their soldiers about America? And how did reality shatter those beliefs? From the earliest days of Hitler's Reich, stories were spun like thread, winding their way through classrooms, newspapers, even the airwaves crackling through battered radios at night. The world, young German boys were told, was divided between the strong and the weak, the visionaries and the complacent. America was the great example of the latter. Teachers in village schools pointed to maps, their fingers jabbing across the Atlantic with disdain, describing a nation soft with excess and laziness. American soldiers, the lessons went, were spoiled children playing at war, cowards who would collapse at the first true test. In smoky beer halls and city cinemas, newsreels painted grotesque parodies, rotund Americans slouching in diners, women obsessed with fashion instead of duty, politicians bickering and chasing money. The films lingered on scenes of strikes and protests, then cut abruptly to footage of German order, youth marching, machines humming, flags snapping in the wind. "See," whispered the commentary, "they are divided and weak. They do not believe in anything. We are united and strong." It went deeper than film. From posters on city walls to songs broadcast at dawn, the message was hammered home. The American experiment was a failure. German officers recalled lectures that described American industry as outdated, their society crippled by greed and racial mixing. The average German soldier grew up hearing that American technology was all show, flimsy and mass-produced, unable to withstand the brutal realities of the Eastern Front. Stories circulated of poorly built tanks, planes that fell apart in the sky, ships that sank under their own weight. Even when reports filtered back from the front lines about endless waves of enemy bombers or Sherman tanks rolling in from the sea, there was always an explanation. Quantity, not quality. They build fast because they build weak. For many young men, the idea of fighting Americans brought not fear, but contempt. They joked about American food, endless chewing gum and watery coffee. They rolled their eyes at tales of American GIs loaded with candy and cigarettes, more interested in black market trading than the discipline of a true soldier. In letters home, early accounts from the Western Front described encounters with American prisoners who surrendered quickly, hands raised before a shot was fired. It became a dark kind of comfort, a way to steady nerves and keep hope alive even as the world around them cracked. But the propaganda was a two-edged sword. The more the Reich promised an easy victory over the decadent West, the harder it became to make sense of any setback. When American tanks broke through at Normandy, or when their bombers darkened the sky over Hamburg, explanations grew desperate. "They must be cheating," some whispered. "They have no honor, only numbers. They are not like us." Still, these rationalizations could only last so long. Quiet doubts grew behind closed doors, in the barracks, and at family tables where news from the front became harder to twist. Yet for most, the illusion held. It had to. To admit otherwise, to believe that America could be strong, disciplined, and creative, was to accept a terrifying reality. It would mean questioning everything, not just about the enemy, but about themselves. What if the Reich was wrong? What if the world was more complicated than the black and white stories they'd been fed. As the war ground on, some officers began to notice cracks. There were rumors from older veterans, hints of something different in the way the Americans fought, the endless supply of materiel, the confidence with which they advanced. But few listened. It was easier to cling to the story, to mock the enemy, and wait for the inevitable collapse of the American will. But the illusion couldn't last forever. Capture would bring a revelation no one anticipated. A collision between myth and reality so profound that it would leave lifelong scars, and, for some, open doors to new ways of seeing the world. Misinformation has always been a weapon, sometimes more dangerous than bullets or bombs. In every war, then and now, those in power shape the story, twisting facts and fears into a shield against the unknown. We like to believe we're immune, that only others can be fooled. But propaganda works precisely because it wraps itself around our hopes and our fears, feeding us what we want to believe. History warns us that accepting easy answers and simple villains leads only to heartbreak. The challenge, in any era, is to pause and look beyond the slogans, the rumors, the images that seem so clear. If we can do that, if we dare to doubt the stories we've been told, maybe we can see the world not as we wish it to be, but as it truly is. And from there, real understanding and even peace can begin. How did a lifetime of propaganda prepare these men for what was coming? They had marched beneath banners, sung the songs, and watched the maps change color each season. Red for victory, black for loss. But when surrender finally came, it arrived not as a moment of heroism or grand gesture, but in the silent, shivering dawns of foreign fields. Normandy, North Africa, Italy, places that had become etched into memory by mud, blood, and a longing for home. Some were just boys, still carrying the wide-eyed look of farm sons and students who had grown up too fast. Their uniforms were stiff with dust and sweat, faces hollowed by months of fighting and fear. For many, the final order came in a language stripped of bravado. "Lay down your arms. It is over." There was no grand speech, only the sound of rifles dropped on the ground, the cold clink of metal, and the collective gasp of surrender. The moments after defeat were the longest of their lives. For days, sometimes weeks, they had watched the sky, waited for orders, clung to rumors that the tide might still turn. When the moment arrived, fear cut sharper than any enemy's bayonet. What would become of them now? They remembered stories whispered in the trenches, warnings about the Americans and the British. Would there be mercy, or would they vanish, nameless, into the chaos that followed every lost war? Some wept openly, shoulders shaking as if the tears could wash away the shame. Others clenched their jaws and stared into the distance, refusing to let the enemy see them broken. There was guilt, too. Guilt for surviving when so many comrades had fallen, for not fighting to the last, for having dared to hope for peace. Captivity felt like a kind of death, the end of everything they had been trained to believe. Marching to the rear, they passed through the ruins of once proud towns. French villagers stared, sometimes with hatred, sometimes with a weary pity that stung worse than anger. In North Africa, the sun beat down, unrelenting. In Italy, the dust stuck to their tongues, thick with defeat. Along the roads, there were always reminders. Burned-out tanks, boots left in the mud, letters never sent. Their captors, for the most part, were professional, businesslike, even bored. To the Allied soldiers, it was just another day, another batch of prisoners, another step toward ending the war. The Germans noticed this, the casual way the Americans smoked, the easy banter, the way they treated their own wounded, and even, sometimes, offered water to the enemy. There were rare moments when a guard would meet a prisoner's eyes, something unspoken passing between them. A recognition, perhaps, that everyone here was simply trying to survive. But the uncertainty gnawed at them. The world had shrunk to the length of a marching column, the inside of a barbed wire enclosure, the memory of a home they might never see again. Some tried to keep their spirits alive with songs or quiet jokes, holding on to their language and identity in the face of the unknown. Others withdrew, eyes hollow, lost in private agony. With defeat came exile, but nothing could prepare them for where they were going next. There was a rumor, at first barely believed, that some would be sent far away, across the sea to a land of endless cities and impossible wealth. It sounded like another lie, another story for frightened boys. But soon the trains began to move, and the reality of their new fate became impossible to ignore. It's easy to draw lines between us and them, to talk of enemies as faceless, as shadows on the other side of the wire. But war is always, at its core, a story of people, young and old, brave and afraid, each bearing hopes and scars no different from our own. The cost is never paid in numbers or statistics, but in broken hearts, in empty tables, in the quiet prayers of mothers and sons. We remember the victors, but each soldier, no matter their uniform, carries memories that linger long after the last shot is fired. To humanize the enemy is not to excuse the past, but to understand the true price of conflict, and perhaps to find, in that understanding, a better way forward. The shared cost of war is carried by all, and sometimes recognizing this truth is the first step toward healing. What awaited them on the other side of the ocean? The journey began in the dead of night, with the shuffling of boots on cobblestones and the low murmur of voices too tired to hope. German prisoners, stripped of their insignia, but not their memories, were herded in silent columns to waiting trains, then onto crowded ports where the horizon bled into the sea. For many, it was the first time they had seen the ocean up close, a cold, endless void that seemed to promise nothing but oblivion. They were packed into the holds of Liberty ships, vessels built for war, and nothing else. Below deck, the air grew thick with sweat and uncertainty. The bunks were narrow and stacked in tiers, the only privacy a thin woolen blanket and the hush of exhaustion. At night, the ship rocked and groaned, the iron hull creaking as waves battered its sides. Above, hatches clanged shut, sealing in hundreds of men with their fears, their whispered prayers, and the sickly, sweet stench of too many bodies in too little space. Rumors filled the darkness, swirling faster than the air itself. Some whispered that they were being taken to England, others that America meant years of forced labor in mines or fields. Stories circulated of U-boats lurking beneath the waves, ready to attack their own countrymen rather than let them fall into enemy hands. Each night brought new anxiety. A sudden jolt as the ship changed course, a muffled explosion far off, the haunted silence when the engines slowed and no one knew why. Yet, for all the dread, there were small moments of surprise. The American guards, mostly young men themselves, seemed almost indifferent to the prisoners' past. They checked the holds, distributed rations, bread, tinned meat, sometimes even chocolate. A few learned enough German to joke or share a cigarette, breaking the monotony with gestures that felt strangely human. Some prisoners found themselves talking, shyly at first, then with a growing sense of curiosity. "Where are we going?" one would ask. The answer, always delivered with a shrug or a grin, "You'll see." The monotony of the sea became its own torment. Days blurred together, gray light filtering through a single porthole, meals served by the clock, the steady thrum of engines that marked time as surely as any calendar. Some tried to keep spirits up with quiet songs or stories of home. Others drifted into themselves, lost in worry or regret. There were those who kept journals, writing in tiny script about the taste of the air, the sound of distant laughter, the ache of not knowing what tomorrow might bring. Every so often, the prisoners were allowed on deck for air. It was then, standing beneath the vast sky, that they caught glimpses of the American Navy. Ships so numerous and varied that it defied everything they'd been told. Where the Reich boasted of its U-boats, here was a fleet that stretched across the horizon. Destroyers, transports, supply ships, all moving with clockwork precision. The sight left some awestruck, others frightened. If this was what America could send across the sea, what awaited them on land? One night, during a rare lull, an older guard sat with a group of prisoners, passing out cigarettes and listening to their broken English. "You're not the enemy anymore," he said quietly, the words hanging in the salt air. "Not here, just men who want to go home." The moment was brief, but it stayed with them, a hint that their captors were not the monsters propaganda had promised. Still, anxiety gnawed at every waking hour. They thought of home, of mothers waiting by silent windows, of letters that would never arrive. They wondered if their families knew they were alive, or if they had already become names on a list, gone forever. The uncertainty pressed in as tightly as the steel hull itself. Then, after weeks adrift, land appeared. A thin line first, then growing into a world of motion and promise. As the ships drew closer to American shores, the prisoners crowded the rails, straining for a first glimpse. The coastline was nothing like they'd imagined. There were bustling ports, rows of warehouses, clusters of buildings that seemed impossibly new and vast. Men in clean uniforms moved purposefully along the docks. No ruins, no signs of want, only a world in motion. After weeks at sea, the first sight of the new world brought more confusion than relief. Would America match the nightmares they'd been told, or something else entirely? It takes courage to cross the threshold of the unknown, to set foot in a world where nothing is familiar, and every story you've ever believed is put to the test. For these men, the journey was more than miles traveled across water. It was a passage from one way of seeing the world to another. They had been taught to fear, to hate, to expect only the worst from the strangers who now held their fate. Yet in the darkness, kindness sometimes appeared. A shared joke, a small act of mercy, a moment of understanding. Facing the unknown is never easy. It strips away certainty and demands humility, the willingness to listen and to learn. In that space, new truths can take root, and the hardest journeys may become the most important. The courage to face the unknown, this too is part of every great story. For days, the sea had been their whole world, gray, endless, and indifferent. But when the ships finally slowed and the engines fell silent, a nervous current swept through every hold. German prisoners crowded the portholes and pressed against the rails, eyes searching the horizon for some sign of what awaited them. No one spoke at first. The scale of the approaching land stole even their anxiety. What they saw was not the ruin they had expected, but a vibrant tapestry of green fields and rising skylines. The coastline was alive with motion, docks lined, with workers, cranes swinging in wide arcs, trucks rumbling over roads as smooth as glass. The air was different, too, softer, filled with the scent of pine and diesel, the faint sweetness of spring. In the distance, trains snaked across the countryside, hundreds of cars long, each loaded with grain, coal, or the glint of new machinery. No one could count them all. It was as if the world itself moved to a rhythm that never missed a beat. The first step onto American soil felt surreal, like waking inside someone else's dream. The guards on the docks didn't shout. They spoke, in calm voices, herding the prisoners with practiced patience. Some even offered water and sandwiches, their casual generosity at odds with every tale the men had heard. Personal testimonies from the time capture the sense of disbelief. A young corporal from Bavaria wrote, "I thought I had landed in a fairy tale. Everywhere there were people laughing, not from cruelty, but from happiness. We had expected hostility, but were met with smiles and a kind of curiosity. The Americans looked at us not as monsters, but as men who had simply lost their war. One officer, hardened by years on the Eastern Front, recalled the shock of seeing children running beside the wire fences, waving at the newcomers with wide-eyed innocence. "It was not what I had prepared for," he admitted later. "I did not know how to answer them." Archival photographs from those first days show lines of German prisoners, gaunt and wary, clutching their meager belongings. Behind them, despise, ports stretch out in dizzying scale. Ships being loaded and unloaded at a frenetic pace. Mountains of crates stacked like children's toys. Factories belching steam just beyond the horizon. The prisoners noticed everything. New cars by the hundreds, fresh produce piled high in market stalls, the shining glass of city buildings that seemed untouched by war. There was no rationing here, no boarded-up windows, no desperate scramble for scraps. The abundance was overwhelming. As the trains rolled inland, the landscape unfurled in ways they had never imagined. Mile after mile of well-tended farmland gave way to rolling hills, dense forests, and then, suddenly, cities on a scale that dwarfed anything in Europe. In Chicago, New York, St. Louis, they saw towers of stone and steel, streets buzzing with life at all hours. The trains themselves were an astonishment. Sleek, powerful engines pulling endless cars, always on time, always moving. At one stop, a group of prisoners watched as workers unloaded box after box of oranges, the air thick with citrus. One man, in disbelief, turned to his companion and whispered, "They eat like kings." The guards, too, remained a puzzle. Though vigilant, they rarely displayed cruelty. Many were young, barely older than the prisoners themselves. They joked with each other, sang popular songs, even shared cigarettes on occasion. When the prisoners looked afraid or confused, some guards would offer a kind word or a gentle pat on the shoulder, as if to say, "You are safe now, at least for a while." This kindness unsettled many, eroding the old stories they clung to for comfort. For the officers, the shock was especially acute. Letters home captured their bewilderment and awe. "Everything is bigger here," wrote one. "The farms, the cities, the trains. There is so much of everything that it is almost unbearable. The people are confident, unafraid. They speak their minds and laugh in the open. How can we have been so wrong?" Some wrote with a sense of envy, others with dread. "If Germany had even half these resources," one captain lamented, "the war would never have been lost." Yet beneath the marvel, there was an undercurrent of confusion, even fear. What did it mean, this endless wealth and power? What would happen to men like them in a place so different, so unfathomably vast? If the ports were impressive, the journey inland would be unforgettable. The prisoners sensed that their true ordeal, and perhaps their true awakening, had only just begun. There are moments in life when the world cracks open, and awe rushes in, unbidden and unstoppable. To witness something so vast, so utterly beyond your imagining, is to feel the weight of old beliefs slip away. Wonder is not weakness. It is the beginning of freedom. For those German prisoners, the first sight of America was a shattering of chains not made of iron, but of stories and fear. In that instant, the myths of home, the warnings and the hate fell, silent, replaced by the simple truth of abundance and hope. We all carry mental chains, forged by what we are told and what we expect. But sometimes, the world gives us a glimpse of something new. And in that light, we can begin to see not just with our eyes, but with our hearts. Awe, after all, is the first step toward understanding. Why did German officers write home in disbelief? The gates closed behind them, and for a moment the world felt suspended between captivity and a strange, tentative hope. American POW camps were nothing like the nightmarish visions that haunted German imaginations. Rows of barracks surrounded by neat fences, orderly pathways, and a sense of calm efficiency that seemed almost surreal. There were guards on every watchtower, yes, but their manner was more businesslike than cruel. Orders were clear, discipline firm, yet there was a sense that life here followed its own kind of rhythm, one far gentler than the Germans had expected. The first shock came at mealtime. In Germany, hunger had been an uninvited companion. Rations growing thinner, bread stretched with sawdust, watery soup barely enough to sustain a soldier's strength. Here, trays clattered with food that seemed endless. White bread thick with butter, steaming vegetables, meat in generous portions, fruit and coffee that was strong and black. The memory of real milk, of whole eggs and sugar, struck many silent with gratitude and confusion. Some wondered if it was a trick, or a brief indulgence soon to be replaced with privation. But day after day, the meals came, and soon the hollow cheeks and tired eyes of the new arrivals began to fill out. Work, too, was a revelation. The Geneva Convention required prisoners be kept busy, and so they were set to tasks that ranged from tending fields to repairing roads, working in canneries, or gathering firewood. There was structure and purpose in the labor, a dignity that surprised many. The Americans were clear: do your job, follow the rules, and you would be treated fairly. At first, suspicion lingered. Some POWs expected sabotage, broken tools, dangerous machinery, insults whispered just out of earshot. Instead, they were taught their work, shown by patient supervisors how to use new equipment, and sometimes praised for a job well done. Recreation was another bewildering kindness. Soccer fields and baseball diamonds appeared inside the wire. There were libraries stocked with German books and American magazines, even instruments for makeshift orchestras and theater troupes. Prisoners organized clubs, painted murals, wrote newsletters, staged plays. There were language lessons and debates, contests and card games, the sounds of laughter echoing at dusk. For many, it was the first time in years that life had felt remotely normal. What shocked the prisoners most, however, was the generosity that permeated daily life. The Red Cross delivered packages not just from Germany, but from Americans too. Boxes filled with cigarettes, chocolate, socks, writing paper. Some locals, remembering their own families divided by war, sent small gifts or letters of friendship. There were even rare moments when townspeople visited the camp fence, waving or tossing apples to the men inside. Stories spread of American guards going out of their way to help, sneaking a prisoner an extra blanket during a cold snap, listening to a homesick boy talk about Bavaria or the Rhine. For those raised on stories of American cruelty or indifference, the contrast was unsettling. One prisoner, a former Nazi youth leader, wrote in his diary, "If our government told the truth about these people, we would never have come here expecting monsters. They are fair, sometimes even friendly. They see us as men." Another recalled, with a mix of shame and relief, how an American doctor had rushed to save a wounded prisoner's life, setting aside uniforms, looking only at the wound. Yet not everything was easy. There were arguments, fights, moments of despair. Some officers tried to maintain Nazi discipline, punishing those who fraternized too closely with guards or workers. The camps were a strange microcosm. Some men clung to the old order, others began to question everything. For those whose faith in the Reich was already wavering, kindness became both a balm and a torment. How could the enemy show more mercy than their own leaders had ever done? As weeks turned into months, the lines between captor and captive blurred in subtle ways. American guards learned to pronounce German names. Prisoners sang American songs in the evenings, And sometimes a baseball landed beyond the fence, prompting laughter as guards and prisoners tossed it back and forth. Birthdays were quietly celebrated, small victories savored. A letter from home, a new book, a rare holiday meal. The greatest surprise of all was not just the comfort, but the dignity afforded to men who had once been sworn enemies. It was a dignity that demanded, in its own quiet way, a reckoning with all they had believed. There was kindness in unlikely places, a generosity that could not be explained by propaganda or fear. But it wasn't just comfort. They saw something else, something terrifying to Nazi beliefs. The power and unity of American industry, a society not only prosperous, but inclusive and alive with possibility. True dignity reveals itself in the places where you least expect it, in the handshake across barbed wire, in the gift passed quietly through a fence, in the moments when the boundaries between enemy and friend dissolve. Kindness has a strength all its own. It challenges hatred and suspicion, cracks the armor of fear, and shows us who we might become if we choose compassion over vengeance. In the American camps, prisoners found not just food and shelter, but reminders of what it means to be seen as fully human, even in defeat. These small gestures ripple outward, far beyond the walls that once divided nations. Sometimes, the greatest revolution is not fought on battlefields, but in simple acts of dignity and decency. For the men inside those camps, such moments would linger long after their return home. A quiet, stubborn seed of hope. What did POWs witness inside America's factories? If life inside the camps had begun to rewrite the old stories, it was what lay beyond the fences that truly upended the prisoners' world. Soon after their arrival, many German POWs were assigned to work details in nearby towns, factories, and farms. For men raised on tales of American laziness and incompetence, it was a journey into the heart of a machine that defied every expectation. A living, breathing testament to the strength of collective effort. The first thing that struck them was the noise. American factories pulsed with energy, a roar of stamping presses, the relentless clatter of assembly lines, voices shouting instructions over the symphony of progress. The air vibrated with urgency. Here, tanks, trucks, and planes rolled off the lines in numbers that seemed impossible. Men and women worked side by side, sweat beading on brows, sleeves rolled up, laughter mingling with the shouts of foremen. The rhythm was hypnotic. Every hand in motion, every movement precise. The whole operation a choreography of purpose. In one sprawling plant, a young prisoner named Carl found himself working on the line for B-24 bombers. The wings stretched above his head, dwarfing even his boldest sense of scale. He watched in awe as teams of workers, many no older than himself, riveted metal with speed and confidence. Women in coveralls climbed ladders, swinging tools as deftly as any man. Black and white workers labored side by side, their laughter and camaraderie cutting through decades of German prejudice. "I saw Americans working together as equals," Carl later recalled, "and I could not understand how a country with such freedom could be so strong." Agricultural fields told a similar story of abundance and unity. POWs who had grown up on small, hard-scrabbled German farms now gazed across acres of wheat and corn that stretched to the horizon. American farmers harnessed machines of every shape and size, tractors plowing 4 furrows at once, combines reaping fields in a fraction of the time. The land itself seemed inexhaustible. It wasn't just the scale, but the attitude. Neighbors shared equipment, helped one another at harvest, and even found time to teach the German workers new techniques. In some communities, POWs were invited to lunch on the porch, to drink sweet iced tea, and listen to stories about distant cousins fighting in Europe or the Pacific. What stunned the prisoners most was the sense of belonging. In Germany, work had always come with a sense of duty and hierarchy, the weight of us versus them. Here, Even in wartime, the American spirit seemed built on inclusion. Factories displayed signs declaring, "We're all in this together." Posters on break room walls reminded workers to look out for one another, to value every hand and every hour. While racism and inequality certainly persisted, no system is perfect. Even the smallest factory or farm felt infused with a promise. Anyone willing to work could be part of something bigger than themselves. In the steel mills and shipyards, prisoners witnessed feats of production that bordered on the miraculous. Rails glowed with fresh-laid iron. Ships took shape in weeks rather than months. The sheer volume left the POWs reeling. At night, some confided to one another in hushed tones, "If this is what America can do in a year, what hope did we ever have?" The realization was both humbling and terrifying. They had been taught that American industry was wasteful, undisciplined, slow to mobilize. Instead, they saw workers solving problems on the fly, managers consulting with floor crews, teams improvising and adapting to meet impossible quotas. Each obstacle became a challenge to overcome, not a reason to quit. Some prisoners tried to dismiss what they saw. "They only build so many because they build badly," one insisted, echoing Nazi talking points. But the evidence was everywhere. Planes flying overhead, tanks rolling off trains, supplies stacked in neat mountains. The machinery worked. The war machine, powered by democracy and collective sacrifice, was unstoppable. Over time, small interactions left lasting impressions. A German mechanic partnered with an American supervisor to fix a tricky engine, the two sharing grease and jokes despite the gulf between their lives. On a Texas farm, a former paratrooper marveled as a group of teenagers, including black and white boys, finished a harvest with music blaring from a battered radio, their spirits unbroken by the news from distant battlefields. In letters home, prisoners admitted, sometimes grudgingly, that what they saw defied all they had been told. Personal beliefs began to shift in subtle but significant ways. The sense of superiority, the faith in Nazi propaganda, withered under the light of experience. Some POWs grew curious about the American way, about unions, about free speech, about the possibilities of a society that welcomed change. They noticed how even workers could question their bosses, suggest improvements, or joke about politicians without fear. This freedom unsettled men raised on obedience, yet it also sparked questions about what might be possible back home. Not every prisoner was ready to embrace the lessons of the factories and fields. Some clung to old loyalties, others retreated into silence, shaken by doubt. Yet, as the weeks passed, the unity and productivity they witnessed began to undermine the certainties that had once seemed unshakable. The greatest revelation was not just the abundance of material goods, but the abundance of hope, the belief that anyone, no matter their background, could contribute and belong. No propaganda could have prepared them for this display of power and unity. The old stories simply could not stand against what the prisoners saw with their own eyes. The true engine of progress is not the work of a single leader, but the collective spirit of millions, people from every background, each adding their strength to the whole. In the factories and fields of wartime America, this truth became undeniable. The power of a free society is not just in its wealth, but in its willingness to welcome the hands and hearts of all who wish to build. It is not perfection, but the stubborn refusal to give up on one another, the courage to argue, to adapt, to create together even when times are hard. In every wrench turned, every row harvested, there is the echo of a larger hope. That unity, real, imperfect, hard-won, can shape a better world. The spirit of collective effort is a story worth telling, and a legacy worth sharing. How did these experiences change their loyalties and beliefs? When the first letters slipped through the censors and made their way from America to Germany, something quietly revolutionary began. In simple ink and halting script, German prisoners tried to explain a world their families could hardly imagine. The letters spoke of daily bread and clean clothes, of work that was not punishment but purpose, of guards who sometimes smiled, sometimes joked, and almost always kept their word. In their diaries and journals, men poured out thoughts they dared not speak aloud. Here, I am treated not as an animal, but as a man. Some stories were almost incredulous. One young private, barely 20, and still haunted by the terror of Normandy, wrote home about his first 4th of July in camp. He described the fireworks, rockets bursting in colors over the wire, music drifting from the loudspeakers, American guards handing out ice cream to anyone who wanted it, even to the prisoners. "We are the enemy, but tonight we are not treated so," he marveled. Another recounted Christmas, a choir of prisoners and guards singing Silent Night together, their voices carrying into the darkness, blending German and English in one fragile hope. Post-war interviews, recorded in worn notebooks and scratchy audio tapes decades later, revealed a slow transformation. Some former POWs recalled arriving in America full of hatred and suspicion, convinced they would be starved, beaten, or simply forgotten. Yet those expectations crumbled in the face of everyday decency. "It was the first time I saw black men and white men working together, eating together," recalled a former tank gunner, his voice still full of wonder 50 years on. "No one cared where you came from. If you did your job, you were respected." In the fields and factories, men learned to value the small freedoms that defined American life. They noticed that even in wartime, people debated politics openly, questioned orders, laughed at their leaders. It was a kind of confidence rooted not in fear, but in a belief that society could, and should, always be improving. Some POWs began to ask the American guards about their lives, their families, their country. The conversations, sometimes awkward, sometimes animated, grew into friendships that would outlast the wire. A handful of prisoners wrote, years later, of how America changed their dreams. One became a baker, inspired by the abundance he had witnessed in a small-town grocery. Another took up farming, determined to bring new methods home. Others would remember with a smile the first time they tasted Coca-Cola, or the day a guard taught them to throw a baseball. These moments, trivial on the surface, became windows into a way of life that seemed impossibly open and generous. For some, the transformation was so profound they never wished to leave. In rare cases, men petitioned to remain in America after the war, fearful of returning to a ruined homeland or to old ways of thinking. The camp, once a symbol of defeat, had become a place of unexpected hope, a second chance. Even those who returned to Germany carried with them a quiet admiration for the country that had shown them respect in their lowest hour. As one former officer wrote, "I came here believing only what I had been taught. I leave with my eyes open and my heart changed." But what happened when they tried to share these stories back home? That would prove a different kind of challenge, as memories clashed with disbelief, suspicion, and the stubbornness of old wounds. Some POWs never wanted to leave. Why? The answer lay in the transformation they experienced, a testament to the power of kindness to turn enemies into friends and strangers into citizens of a wider world. Perspective is the bridge between worlds, the place where empathy is born and where change becomes possible. When we allow ourselves to see through another's eyes, the lines that divide us begin to blur. The German POWs who left America were not the same men who had arrived. They had been tested, not by cruelty, but by a different kind of strength, the willingness of a nation to show dignity and respect to its enemies. This simple act reshaped their beliefs and, in many cases, their lives. True transformation rarely comes from force. It grows from understanding, from the courage to listen, and from the humility to learn. In a world too often hardened by suspicion and fear, the stories of these men remind us that real power lies in empathy, and that every life, given a chance, can be changed by a shift in perspective. The first letters that reached Germany from American camps read like dispatches from another planet. "We have enough to eat every day," wrote a young soldier named Heinz. "There is bread, real bread, and meat, and even fruit. The guards are not cruel. Some even smile at us." Mothers and fathers, reading such words beneath the weak light of rationed lamps, felt a dizzying blend of relief and disbelief. Their own tables were bare, their own nights cold and hungry. To imagine a son, a brother, a husband eating well behind enemy lines, it seemed impossible, almost indecent. Other letters described the routines of work, the surprise of shared jokes with Americans, the spectacle of endless trains rolling through the heartland. "I have never seen so many machines in my life," wrote an officer from a Midwest camp. "And the people, they are confident, open. They do not seem like our enemy at all." Some families felt comforted, grateful their loved ones were alive and spared the horrors that had become daily news. Others, steeped in years of propaganda and loss, were suspicious, even resentful. "Do not believe everything you read," warned one uncle, a veteran of the last war. "The Americans are clever. They will trick you." For the prisoners, writing home was a careful dance. Censors read every word, but the greater pressure came from within. The struggle to balance honesty and the fear of being misunderstood. How to describe a world that had upended every story you'd ever known? Some softened the truth, afraid of sowing envy or suspicion among families still struggling in bombed-out cities. Others tried to explain their awe, only to receive curt replies. "How can you live with the enemy so easily?" demanded a childhood friend in one reply. "Have you forgotten who you are?" In some homes, the letters ignited arguments. Younger sisters dreamed of America, of bright cities and bustling streets. Fathers dismissed such talk as fantasy or dangerous temptation. Neighbors gossiped, speculating about what really happened in those far-off camps. The Reich did its best to control the narrative, publishing stories of supposed abuse, urging families to distrust enemy propaganda. Yet rumors spread, and so did hope, a dangerous commodity in a nation battered by war. There were, too, the unspoken secrets, the lines between what could be said and what must remain hidden. Some POWs wrote cautiously of kindness from Americans, hinting at friendships or even gratitude. Others buried such feelings, afraid of being branded traitors or weaklings if word reached the wrong ears. They lived with a quiet longing for the freedom to speak the whole truth, a longing that sometimes outlasted the war itself. Not all responses from Germany were skeptical or hostile. Some families, tired of pain and loss, found comfort in the glimpses of a better world. "Stay safe, my son," wrote one mother, her words trembling with relief. "If you find goodness in these people, remember it. Bring it home." But just as often, the distance between lived experience and inherited belief proved too great to bridge. But as the war dragged on, cracks appeared on both sides of the Atlantic. The POWs grew bolder in what they shared. Families grew more curious and sometimes more divided. The story of captivity became a story of transformation. One carried in whispers, in code, in the spaces between words. And always, there was the question, what secrets did POWs keep, even from their own countrymen? Truth and loyalty are seldom easy companions. To honor one can mean betraying the other, especially in times of war. The POWs who wrote home faced an impossible task: to be honest about their lives while not betraying their family's suffering or the expectations of a wounded nation. Theirs was a daily negotiation between gratitude for kindness received and loyalty to those left behind. It is the oldest struggle in every conflict. How much of what we see and learn do we dare to share? In their letters, we glimpse the burden of those who move between worlds, carrying hope and doubt in equal measure. Their story is a reminder that healing requires honesty, and that real loyalty sometimes means challenging old beliefs in the hope of a better tomorrow. The struggle between truth and loyalty endures long after the shooting stops. No prison camp was free from crisis. Tension simmered just beneath the surface, sometimes erupting in ways no one could predict. There were escape attempts, some daring, some foolish. A handful of POWs tunneled beneath the wire, vanishing into cornfields at night, chased by dogs and the distant crackle of alarm bells. Most were caught within hours, hungry and disoriented, but not all. One pair of young men made it to a nearby farm, where the family, instead of turning them in, offered them a meal and a moment's rest before gently urging them back to the authorities. "You are someone's son," the farmer's wife said. "This war will not last forever." The POWs returned to camp, chastened and bewildered by such unexpected kindness. Not all stories ended so well. There were accidents and sudden tragedies, illness sweeping through the barracks, a storm that toppled a watchtower, the grief of hearing that loved ones back home had been lost. Sometimes the weight of it all proved too much for men already carrying years of battle and loss. In these moments, it was often the American guards who crossed the distance, sitting in silence beside grieving prisoners, sharing a cigarette or a cup of coffee, offering a quiet word when there was nothing else to say. But it was in the everyday acts of humanity that the most lasting changes took root. When a camp's water pump failed, German and American engineers worked side by side to fix it, laughter mingling with sweat and frustration. On holidays, prisoners and guards exchanged greetings, sometimes even small gifts. An orange, a hand-carved trinket, a photograph from home. A group of prisoners formed a choir, inviting the guards to join them in song. Music, for a moment, erased the fences. A handful of American guards came to see the men in their care not as prisoners, but as fellow travelers on a difficult road. One young sergeant, whose brother had died in Normandy, found himself playing chess with a former Wehrmacht officer. At first, they spoke little, only moving pieces. But as the weeks passed, their matches turned into conversations about home, about mothers and wives, about what they might do when the war was finally over. Both men, changed by grief, found solace in the ritual. Neither could forgive the war, but both found a measure of peace in understanding the other's pain. There were moments when lines blurred completely. In the aftermath of a tornado, guards and prisoners worked shoulder to shoulder to clear the wreckage and tend to the injured. When a German doctor risked his life to save an American's, the men of both camps came together in an uneasy, heartfelt celebration. These moments of shared struggle and grace revealed that the real enemy was not the man across the wire, but the hatred and fear that war had cultivated in every heart. Some POWs began to look at their captors with new eyes, not just as jailers, but as individuals capable of generosity and remorse. And on the other side, Americans who had lost friends and family to German bullets discovered a kind of reluctant respect for the men they had once sworn to defeat. Out of hardship grew a cautious hope that, even after so much suffering, forgiveness and change were possible. And then, at last, the war ended. But what about the men forever changed? The world they would soon re-enter was not the world they had left. The guns fell silent, but in the quiet, the true reckoning began. What happened to the POWs when the guns finally fell silent? Forgiveness is never easy. It asks us to set down the burdens of anger and grief, to risk opening our hearts to the possibility of change. For the POWs and their captors, peace was not just a treaty signed on paper, but 1,000 small acts of courage. The willingness to listen, to share, to see the enemy as human. These moments, rare and fragile, are what give hope its power. They remind us that even after the darkest nights, dawn is possible if we choose to build bridges instead of walls. The possibility of peace begins in the willingness to forgive, not to forget the past, but to shape a better future. In every act of kindness, every word of understanding, there is the seed of something new, a promise that, no matter how bitter the war, the heart can heal. The end of the war arrived with a mixture of disbelief and relief, spreading slowly through the camps like the first rays of a hesitant dawn. News came by radio, then by letters, then by the sudden loosening of routines. The guards smiled more, paperwork multiplied, and rumors ran wild. Some said they would be sent home at once. Others whispered that it might take months, even years. For many POWs, the prospect of freedom was more complicated than they ever expected. Bittersweet farewells became the order of the day. Friendships had formed across the wire, unlikely bonds between prisoners and guards, or among men from opposite ends of Germany who might never have spoken in peace. There were hurried goodbyes, promises to write, a last photograph tucked inside a pocket. Some American farmers and factory owners gathered to see their workers off, pressing small gifts or handwritten notes into calloused hands. "Remember us," they said, and many did. As the first repatriation trains rolled east, anticipation mingled with anxiety. The journey home was a journey into the unknown. What waited for them in the ruins of Germany? Family? Shame? A chance to rebuild? Or a lifetime marked as a prisoner? A survivor of defeat? There was a sense of gratitude for the end of captivity. Yet for some, America had come to feel like a second home, a place where they had been treated with unexpected dignity, where they had discovered music or tasted freedom, or seen what was possible when strangers treated each other as equals. A handful of POWs, those without families, or those who feared what awaited in the rubble, petitioned to remain in America. Some succeeded, blending quietly into a new world, becoming farmers, laborers, even small business owners. Others would wait years, their memories of camp life lingering long after the rest of the world had moved on. But for most, the return was a collision with loss. The Germany they came home to was not the nation they remembered. Streets were scarred by bomb craters, cities hollowed out by war. Families had been scattered, homes lost, hopes worn thin. Many POWs found themselves strangers not only to their country, but to their old selves. Some brought back more than scars. They carried new ways of seeing, and in quiet moments, new ideas about what could be rebuilt. The adjustment was not always smooth. Former POWs spoke of reverse culture shock, the oddness of abundance now gone, the suspicion from neighbors, the struggle to explain what life had really been like behind the wire. But in every community, a few men planted seeds of change. They shared stories of American farms and factories, of fairness and cooperation, of the strange comfort of being seen as a person, not just a number. They taught new songs to their children, tried new farming methods, started clubs and associations that quietly challenged the old ways. For all their longing for home, many carried a lasting gratitude for what they had experienced, and a hope that something of that spirit might one day take root in the ruins. But what was the true legacy of these encounters? Did America's might change the course of lives and history? The answers lay not just in what was rebuilt, but in the hearts and minds of men forever changed by their captivity and by the unexpected kindness of their former enemies. True transformation rarely announces itself with grand gestures. More often, it grows quietly in the aftermath of struggle, when the noise of conflict gives way to the work of healing. For those who returned from captivity, the wounds of war could not always be seen, but they marked every day that followed. Yet, within those scars, there was room for something new. A changed heart, a wider vision, a willingness to begin again. Trauma can break us, but it can also remake us, teaching strength, humility, and even hope. The men who went home from America carried the lessons of kindness and resilience with them, a testament to the power of change, even in the unlikeliest places. Every journey through darkness shapes us. What matters is not just where we end up, but who we become on the way. Long after the last prisoner stepped through the gates and the camps emptied into memory, the true legacy of those years lingered, woven into families, whispered through generations, shaping the lives of thousands in ways both subtle and profound. For some, the story of captivity in America became a cherished part of family lore, a tale told around dinner tables and at reunions, of strange kindness in a foreign land, of hardship transformed by the unexpected. Children and grandchildren heard about the taste of white bread, the roar of American factories, the friendship of a guard who once shared his lunch. These memories, carefully passed down, became a quiet challenge to bitterness, a reminder that humanity can be found even in the shadow of war. Communities, too, bore the mark of these experiences. In the towns and villages that once housed the camps, a few old-timers remembered their Germans, the young men who had worked their fields or sung in the church choir on Sundays. In some places, reunions were organized decades later, former POWs and local families embracing, weeping, marveling at the strange twists of fate that had brought them together as enemies and left them as friends. There were even marriages, love stories that bridged continents, defied prejudice, and helped heal wounds too deep for words. Yet not all memories fit so easily into the story of reconciliation. Myths and half-truths flourished alongside honest remembrance. Some former POWs struggled for years to be heard, their accounts of fair treatment dismissed as naivete or disloyalty. In post-war Germany, suspicion and shame still haunted those who returned from American camps, their gratitude sometimes mistrusted by neighbors hardened by loss. At the same time, in America, stories of the camps faded behind the myth of unbroken victory, the complex reality of shared suffering and fragile peace often overlooked. Still, the lessons of that time endured. Historians, digging through letters and diaries, uncovered a wealth of stories that challenge the easy narratives of us versus them. They found German officers who returned home determined to fight for democracy, former guards who spoke of the burden and privilege of treating prisoners with dignity. Teachers drew on these stories to teach new generations about the cost of war, the danger of propaganda, and the necessity of empathy. For the 21st century, the relevance is clear. In an age still divided by borders, fear, and misunderstanding, the experiences of German POWs in America stand as a reminder of what is possible when we look beyond the surface of enemy and ally. Their stories show how generosity, curiosity, and simple decency can break cycles of hate, and how every individual, given a chance, can become a bridge rather than a barrier. These lessons reach beyond history books. They live in every act of kindness between strangers, in every effort to welcome the outsider, in the courage to question what we have been told, and to look for truth in the experience of the other. The myth of the enemy, the habit of suspicion, is still with us, but so too is the possibility of change. As the grandchildren of POWs grow old, they inherit not just memories, but a choice to honor the complexity of the past, to refuse the comfort of simple stories, and to seek out the humanity in every life touched by war. The world will always find new reasons to divide, but the legacy of that forgotten chapter is proof that bridges can be built, slowly, painfully, but enduringly. And so the story lives on. What can we learn from this forgotten chapter today? The answer is as personal as it is universal, that dignity and hope can survive even the darkest times, and that the courage to look deeper, beyond myth, beyond memory, remains our most powerful tool for peace. History is not simply a record of what was, but a living dialogue between memory and myth. Each generation shapes the stories it inherits, sometimes polishing them, sometimes questioning, always searching for meaning. The courage to look deeper is what allows us to honor the past without being trapped by it. Myths may comfort, but only honest remembrance can teach. The story of the German POWs in America is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the necessity of compassion, and the endless potential for renewal. To remember is not to glorify or to condemn, but to learn, to see ourselves reflected in those who came before, and to imagine a future where empathy triumphs over fear. The past is never truly gone. It waits for us to understand it, to learn from it, and, in doing so, to change our own story. The journey of German POWs in America is more than just a footnote in history. It is a living reminder of how war, even in its darkest chapters, can reveal the best and worst in all of us. It is a story of surprise and transformation, of walls broken down by simple kindness and minds changed by experience. These men arrived as enemies, carrying heavy burdens of belief and fear. Many left with new eyes, and, sometimes, even a new sense of belonging. Their memories remind us that the true boundaries in life are not drawn on maps, but in our hearts, and that even the deepest divisions can be crossed with empathy, courage, and a willingness to listen. As we look back, let's remember that history is not only the story of nations and battles, but of people, each with a voice, a memory, a lesson to share. In every family, there are untold stories of conflict and reunion, of sorrow and hope, of strangers becoming friends against all odds. When we share these stories, we keep the past alive, not as something frozen or unchanging, but as a source of wisdom for whatever challenges the future may hold. So, I invite you to reflect, to talk with your loved ones, to seek out the stories hidden in old letters and fading photographs. Which other hidden stories are waiting to be told? Which truths still lie unspoken, ready to connect us across time and distance? Your voice matters. Your memories matter. Together, by keeping these stories alive, we ensure that history's lessons are never lost, and that hope endures even in the most unexpected places. Storytelling is more than the sharing of facts. It is the heartbeat of memory, the bridge that binds generations. Through stories, we find ourselves reflected in the eyes of strangers and ancestors alike. We discover that pain can lead to compassion, that even in loss, meaning can be found. The power of storytelling lies in its ability to transform wounds into wisdom and to invite us all into a greater understanding of one another. Each story told is a light in the darkness, a promise that our struggles and hopes are not forgotten. As you leave this story behind, carry its lessons with you. Become a keeper of memory, a seeker of truth, a teller of tales. For in the end, it is our stories, not just our victories or defeats, that shape who we are and who we may yet become.